Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for joining in. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo serdecznie witamy na naszym wykładzie. Jeszcze kolejni uczestnicy dołączają. Bardzo prosimy o chwilkę cierpliwości. W międzyczasie już po raz pierwszy wytłumaczę, jak można przełączyć się na polskie tłumaczenie. Program odbędzie się w języku angielskim, natomiast dostępne jest tłumaczenie na język polski. Aby włączyć tłumaczenie, musicie Państwo na dole ekranu znaleźć ikonkę globusa, kliknąć na nią i wybrać język polski, PL, Polish, polski. To pozwoli na włączenie ścieżki audio właśnie w języku polskim. Ladies and gentlemen, I just explained how one can switch to Polish. If you feel like trying to listen this in Polish, please do that. And let us be slowly beginning. So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jakub Nowakowski. I'm the director of the Galicia Jewish Museum, which is located in Kraków, Poland. And this is an absolute honor and pleasure to welcome all of you this evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are connecting from, during this very special program. Before I will introduce our partners and our key speaker for that evening, let me say a few things about a few technical things. First of all, the program is recorded and will be available for you later on to watch either through YouTube or Facebook or through direct link. Second of all, we will be collecting questions. Please, if you have a question, please write them in the chat. We won't have time to take all the questions, but we will select some of them, and if we'll have time, we'll ask Professor Berenbaum to address these. Szanowni Państwo, raz jeszcze po polsku bardzo serdecznie witam tych z Państwa, którzy chcieliby skorzystać z tłumaczenia. Na dole ekranu powinniście Państwo mieć ikonę globusa. Prosimy o to, żeby tam wybrać język polski i ścieżka po polsku powinna się włączyć. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a special program which is to recognize, to mark 80th anniversary of Aktion Reinhard, the German plan of murdering all of the Polish Jews living in the so-called general government in the parts of Poland that were taken by the Germans after the outbreak of the war. As some of you will know, as a part of the Operation Reinhard, the Germans created killing centers in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And this operation marks the deadliest phase of the Germans' action of committing genocide against the Polish and European Jews. And to mark this program, to mark this anniversary, as the operation started in 1942, Galicia Jewish Museum, Johannesburg Holocaust Genocide Centre, and the Ghetto Fighters House created this program titled 80 Years to Operation Reinhard. This will be a series of 4 lectures given by some of the most recognizable scholars in the field, and we'll focus on different aspects of the Holocaust and different aspects of the Operation Reinhard. And this is again the absolute pleasure and honor for me to be today on this virtual stage with our partners. I'd like to introduce firstly Mrs. Tali Nates, the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust Genocide Centre, who's connected from South Africa, from Johannesburg, South Africa.
Thank you very much, Jakub. Good evening or good morning to everyone joining us for this new series. It is a pleasure for the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre to work with longtime partners, the Galicia Jewish Museum and the Ghetto Fighters House, and coming together, designing this important series of 4 parts was immensely important. Both on a historical level, on a learning level, which I'm looking very much forward to learn specifically today from my colleague and friend of many years, Michael Berenbaum, but also on a personal level. I am a daughter of survivors. On my mother's side, the family was murdered in Treblinka. On my father's side, the family was murdered in Belzec, both Operation Reinhard camps. So for me personally and professionally, I look very much forward to learn together with my colleagues and all of you from the 4-part series. Looking very much forward to it, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tali. And Tali will be speaking about also her family story in the second program, which we will be taking in a month from now, and all the details will be also posted in the chat. And now our second partner in this program, in the creation of this program, is the Ghetto Fighters House, and we have a director, Mr. Yigal Cohen. Yigal, if you could say a few words.
Thank you, Yaakov. Shalom, everyone. I'm delighted to take part in this new series dealing with the Operation Reinhard, the code name for one of the most extraordinary, despicable murders committed in human history. This was an operation in which about a third of those who perished in the Holocaust were murdered. During this operation, 3 of the horrible extermination camps were established: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The narrative and history of the Ghetto Fighters House is connected directly to the Operation Reinhard because hundreds of thousands of Warsaw ghetto Jews were deported to the Treblinka death camp during the operation. Treblinka is the deadliest of the Operation Reinhard camps. During less than a year that the camp exists, around 900,000 Jews were murdered there. Today, 8 years after Operation Reinhard, we gather to remember the millions who perished and the terrible suffering that this murderous operation inflicted on the Jewish people. Alongside this, we also acknowledge and celebrate.
Let me only
Yes.
interrupt for 1 second. Jakob, whoever's handled technology, people are saying that they cannot hear. So let's make sure that everybody can hear. I apologize, Yigal, but
Okay, it's okay.
No, but I think it's only some. We have also reports from others that do hear.
Okay.
So again, if you have problems with hearing, I don't know if it's yes, we see that many people don't have this problem. So please make sure that that you haven't switched to the Polish translation, or else you'll be lost. So we will be trying to solve that case by case. But otherwise, we see that many people have no problems with audio. Sorry.
Okay, can I continue?
please.
Yes.
Okay, I hope that everybody hear me. Today, 8 years after Operation Reinhard, we gather to remember the millions who perished and the terrible suffering that this murderous operation inflicted on the Jewish people. Alongside this, we also acknowledge and celebrate the acts of heroism, both during and after the operation, with the most well-known of them being the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. An important and invaluable relic of these acts of heroism is found in the Ghetto Fighters House in the form of the model of Treblinka. This model was built by Treblinka prisoner and Holocaust survivor, the carpenter Yaakov Yernik, who in his own way resists through documentation and drawing of the camp. I want to thank our partners, Tali Nates, director of the Johannesburg Holocaust Genocide Centre, Yaakov Novakovsky, director of the Galicia Jewish Museum, and Medin Shachar from the Ghetto Fighters House for organizing this series. A special thank you to the guest speaker, Professor Michael Berenbaum. I am sure that today's program and the whole series will provide a moving and learning experience for us all as we examine events from the past and strive for a human society today. Thank you.
Thank you, Yigal, for those moving words. And I think it's now time to introduce, albeit shortly, our guest speaker, Professor Michael Berenbaum, who is actually probably one of the best people in all the world who could deliver this lecture through his knowledge, expertise. He is definitely one of the key experts on the Holocaust. He served, among others, as a deputy director of the United States Presidential Commission on the Holocaust. He has been the project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the director of the Research Institute. If you will go through various Holocaust museums, not only through in the US, you will find Michael's name in many credit boards, as he has been working with a number of institutions, a number of organizations on creating their Holocaust exhibitions. On top of that, he's also an author of publications, a rabbi, and also a filmmaker. So again, this is a very short, and we could spend far more time on introducing Professor Berenbaum, but I think now it's a good time to pass the floor to him. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. This is truly an honor and a pleasure that you're connecting with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one of the proudest titles I bear is a friend of Yaakov and a friend of Tali, friends of long standing. And the reality is that we all work with this material that is very difficult and very powerful. And therefore, those of us who have worked with it for a very long period of time understand that a certain camaraderie has developed as we explore this incredibly difficult material. My job today is very simply is to tell you how we got to Aktion Reinhard, or how the Germans got to Aktion Reinhard, and to give you a general background of the Holocaust. I'm going to, despite what I told Tali before, I'm going to share my screen for a moment and just give you an overview in a very real sense. The great scholar Raoul Hilberg, who was one of the first to develop a framework for understanding the Holocaust, said that if you want to understand the Holocaust, you have to understand essentially 6 words. And if you understand these 6 words, you can begin to understand how it developed. Those of you who saw America in the Holocaust most recently, Ken Burns, Lynn Novak, and Sarah Botstein did a very wonderful job about showing us something that we must understand, which is that the Holocaust was not born whole, that 1933 was different than 1935, was different than 1938, was different than 1940, 41, and certainly different than 1941 and 42, and that it evolved in a very basic way. The best way to begin is to say that Adolf Hitler came to power with 2 priorities. They were articulated brilliantly or clearly in Mein Kampf. And they were, well, number 1, Nazi expansionism, and then the creation of a master race and the series of creations of the inferior race. And the Jews were not only an inferior race, but they were defined as a cancer on German society. And his task, as he saw, was the elimination of Jews, at which point he was not speaking about the murder of Jews, what was later called extermination. I want to talk about Nazi speak. Extermination is what we do to rats and mice. We call it annihilation, though the Nazis called it extermination. It was not a matter of extermination at that point or annihilation. It was a matter of eliminating Jews from Germany and from German space. The problem with the double agenda was that we'll see that they came into conflict at pivotal points in the struggle. Having come to power, let's say a word about Hitler coming to power, and I think it's a word that echoes differently in our world, and everybody who works in the Holocaust understands that today We have to deal with the issues of what happened between 1938 and 1933 and 1918 and 1933. Between 1918 and 1933, we have to deal with that because we have to ask a question: how does a democracy move to a totalitarian and move to an authoritarian, ultimately a totalitarian regime? Let me give it to you in words that may echo some of what we understand today. Some people voted for Hitler because he was an anti-Semite. Some voted for Hitler despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite, but they thought that other items on their agenda they could get through with Hitler coming to power. They also believed that if you invited him into power, the majesty of office, Chancellor of Germany, would force him to moderate and force him to the center. And they believed that his rhetoric was an attraction, but not really a program. Conservative men, leaders all, and I'm being gender specific because they were gender specific at that time, believed that they were smart enough and experienced enough to control him. And what actually happened is that they underestimated their power and seriously underestimated the power of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement. And the result was something that we have to grapple with. When Hilberg explained, so he came to power with an anti-Semitic policy and an expansionist policy. And the first thing that he did when in power was to, first of all, you had the bombing of the Reichstag, which gave the opportunity to impose martial law. A provision of the Weimar Constitution said that you need 2/3 of those present and voting in order to approve martial law. And the easiest way to get, and he came in to power as part of a minority coalition, who then moved to achieve majority status. How do you achieve 2/3 of those present and voting? You intimidate those from being present. You arrest them, you prohibit them from coming, and you intimidate those who are voting. And beginning in March, Hitler ruled by emergency decree, and that later on became the Führerprinzip. His word became law itself, and he subordinated parliament. What happened then in mid-March, March 22nd, 1933, was the establishment of the first concentration camp, which was Dachau, and the possibility of arresting people for protective custody. And we have to understand that the first to be arrested were not Jews, they were trade unionists, political dissidents, social democrats. But the institution that was developed, the concentration camp, is the institution that ultimately evolved, and we have to distinguish between concentration camps, slave labor camps, and ultimately killing centers, death camps. The attack against the Jews was first a financial attack against Jews. April 1, 1933 was the attack, the boycott against Jews, in which all of a sudden you had the attack on Jewish businesses and your grocer, your department store, your local bookstore, your newspaper shop. All of these all of a sudden became, instead of the shop next door, they became Jewish shops. And you had a boycott of Jewish businesses. The most intriguing thing about that is this sign, which we all use in our museums, which has a German language sign and an English translation, because Hitler was proud of what they did. The Nazis were proud of what they did, and they wanted to make sure that everybody understood it. April 7th was the expulsion of Jews from the civil service. Now, we think of civil service only as government workers, but this meant doctors from hospitals, professors from universities, teachers from schools, lawyers from their tasks, judges. All of these were the expulsion of Jews from civil service. And on May 10th, you had, which was Hitler's 100th day in office, which has a special meaning to Americans because of the notion of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 100 Days. By May 10th, you had the book burning, and that was the burning of books by Jewish authors and also by un-Germanic authors. That included people like Jack London and Helene Keller. Helene Keller gave the proceeds of her books to the German Pacifist League. And what you have then is an echo that was said a century earlier by a German poet of Jewish origin, Heinrich Heine, who said that a people who burn books will in the end burn people. And the distance between book burning and people burning was 8 years. The book burning was an attempt to remove Jewish authors and on-Germanic authors, people defined on-Germanic authors, from the sphere of German society. And that was conducted by university students and their professors, which indicates a certain gradual radicalism. The interesting thing to look at is that some Jews got the message and started to leave Germany. And the question became, as the Jews grappled with this, is who believed that it was viable to live in Germany as a Jew? And Walter Lacour once said, the pessimist left, the optimist died. Meaning, if you believed that the world was getting terrible, you left. And if you believed that this would pass and the like, you stayed. Anti-Jewish attacks came in sporadic ways, and then it had a period of time of rest. And the period of time of rest gave you the idea that this was the new normal, and somehow the Jewish community could adjust to it. The first stage in Hilberg's notion of what happened is definition of Jews. If you're going to persecute Jews, if you're an anti-Semite, you have to begin to define Jews. And definition was the first stage in destruction. The 1935 Nuremberg laws defined the Jews biologically based on the religion of their grandparents. That meant the Jew was defined not by the identity they held, not by the religion they practiced, not by the tradition they embraced, not by their sense of belonging to a people, but by a sense of blood. And this became horrific for the Jews because it meant there was no escape. If persecution was religious, you could convert. If it was political, you could leave. If it was social, you could separate. It was economic, you could adjust. But if it's a matter of blood, this becomes an enormous thing. This, we also have to say, is the loss of the rights of citizenship. And in our world today, we see very deeply and very profoundly the meaning and the privileges of citizenship, the rights of citizenship, which means that you have a state to protect you. And Jews who became stateless understood how fragile human rights are if there is not a state or an entity to protect you. The second stage Hilberg spoke of was expropriation, which is removal of the Jews from the German economic sphere. And we have to see that in Jewish history, not as expropriation, which is to make the Germans profit by the elimination of the Jews, but the disemancipation. Throughout a century and a half, Jews had been gaining rights of citizenship, and all of a sudden, disemancipation became a way of taking away those rights. Jews became not citizens, but wards of the state. They lost civil rights. It introduced segregation. It introduced apartheid. It introduced legal discrimination in all sorts of ways. And the idea at this point is, if you make it difficult for Jews to live as Jews in Germany, they will leave. Voluntary self-deportation, voluntary departure. there was only one great problem with that strategy. There was one great problem that emerged immediately, and we'll see the second problem that emerged a little bit later. And that was, the problem was that there was nowhere that was willing to accept the Jews in the numbers to which they had to leave. We saw in the Burns, Novick, and Botstein series, we saw how America was reluctant to receive refugees. And the idea was that if you have to get out, you need, and immigration is always what we call a push-pull phenomenon. You're pushed out of where you want to go, or you were attracted to somewhere else. The push became intense. The pull was anywhere but. The problem was that there were very few places to which Jews could go. That became cemented in 1938 with the Evian Conference, in July 6th through 16th, 1938, with the Evian Conference, when 32 nations gathered, said we have a refugee problem. And everybody is, and the invitation to the conference was, no nation is going to have to change the laws, which means that no quota system that had to be changed in America. Nobody has to expend public funds, which means Jews are going to pay for the resettlement of Jews. Palestine, which is the name of pre-state Israel, is not going to be on the agenda, which made the British participate. And there were words and blessings and concern and goodwill, but nobody was willing to do enough to receive the Jews. And consequently, that strategy developed a problem. The strategy developed a second problem much later on, which is, as the German Reich expanded, more and more Jews came under its control. So in 1938, when Germany in March entered Austria, it had lost 150,000 of 525,000 Jews had voluntarily left Germany because they had to get out. One night, it received another, 200,000 Jews under its control, a net gain of 50,000. If you add to what happened when the Germans entered Czechoslovakia, first the Sudetenland in September of 1938, and then in March of 1939, the rest of Czechoslovakia, more Jews came under its control. And by the time the war began in 1939 with Poland, with the German invasion of Poland, by the time the war began, it had 2 million Jews under its control. 2 million more Jews under its control, because remember, Poland was divided between Soviet occupation and German occupation. And the idea of getting Jews to leave voluntarily becomes essentially a demographic impossibility because of the fact that more and more Jews come under your control. That led Hilberg to define the third stage, which is concentration, but please don't think of concentration camps. Think of ghettos, for example, in German-occupied Poland. Concentration is you keep the Jews together, and then you wait. And for that, concentration meant you had the stage which we call deportation. And that is, you took Jews from villages and hamlets, from small places, and you brought them into large cities, so that ultimately Warsaw itself became the home of 400 to 500,000 Jews. A third of the population of the city lived in 2.6% of its locality. And the ghetto itself became a place in which you lived until. For the Jews, they believed it was until Germany came to its senses, until Germany was defeated in the war, until they were liberated. And in retrospect, but not in prospect, understanding what happened afterwards, ghettoization was a place for German policy to contain the Jews until the moment, and this becomes critical for Aktion Reinhard, until the moment that a decision was made what to do with the Jews, which was then called the final solution to the Jewish problem, and the apparatus was built for their annihilation. And what was the ultimate apparatus built for their annihilation? The ultimate apparatus built for the annihilation was the death camp. So again, definition, you target the population, you define them, you disemancipate them, you remove rights and rights and rights from them, you make them wards of the state, you impoverish them all the way through, and ultimately you concentrate them, you bring them together. Let me talk for a moment about the Jewish response early on, and I want to talk in Germany and establish a very simple principle. Throughout the Holocaust, you see that just because Jews were powerless does not mean that they were passive. They tried all sorts of ways to make their life livable and bearable under the most difficult circumstances. Just because they were powerless does not mean they were passive, and we'll see, if I get time, about the different stages of resistance. And the great scholar from the Swiss scholar Werner Ring said that there were 4 forms of resistance under Nazi oppression. There was, first of all, symbolic resistance, which is the way in which people preserve their humanity. There was polemical resistance, writings, diaries, underground newspapers. Even humor became a way of using the mouth as a means of resisting your oppression. There became self-help, and Jews were masters of self-help and creating all sorts of ways in which they could deal with the situation. And finally, there was armed resistance, but we'll speak about the limitations of armed resistance in a bit. Germany has a problem. It has a massive number of Jews which it is containing. It has Jews in the West, which it's isolating, and only in Amsterdam was there a Jewish residential quarter. Jews were not ghettoized, but they were symbolized, which is what the Jewish star represented. Most had yellow stars in different languages. In Poland, they had white armbands. And the idea was, since you do not know what a Jew looks like and who a Jew is, you make them, unlike, for example, black skin or Asian appearances or Native American appearances, etc., you have to make them visible targets, which results in isolation. Germany invades the Soviet Union and Soviet-occupied territories, and all of a sudden it has a massive number of Jews at their disposal. And the first stage of killing was not the Aktion Reinhard camps. The first stage of killing were what we called the mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen. But we have to understand that the Einsatzgruppen did not operate alone. 3,000 men were sent into Soviet-occupied territories. They worked with local gendarmerie, with native anti-Semites. They had the cooperation of the German and its Axis allies. And one of the most ridiculous documents is a document of the German army complaining, why do they have to dehumanize, complaining about the behavioral Hungarian army. Why do they have to dehumanize the Jews if they're going to kill them anyhow? Why can't they just kill them directly? You have to ask yourself what's going on here. All of a sudden, the German army is saying, the German army is saying essentially, let's just kill them. We don't have to torture them en route to dying. What is the mobile killing units? The mobile kill and let's understand the Germans did not operate alone. In Lithuania, 2 out of 3 Jews were killed by Lithuanians. In Latvia, the number is similar. It's somewhere between 50 and 66%. In Estonia, every Jew who was killed in Estonia was killed by Estonians, not by Germans. What did that mean? That meant you took them to a wadi, to a valley, to an outskirts of the city. You shot them one by one, bullet by bullet, town by town, village by village, hamlet by hamlet, men, women, and children. The most famous of this is clearly Babi Yar, where 33,771 Jews were killed in a 2-day period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in September of 1941. And this killing continued not only through one wave, but through 2 waves of killing. But the killing had a problem not for the victims, it had a problem for the killers. The problem for the killers is apparently they needed alcohol to deaden themselves afterwards. And then gradually they needed alcohol to deaden themselves before the killing and during. And the other part is it was too public. It was seen by too many people. And that becomes a pivotal background. There's also some evidence of breakdowns. And there is a claim, a post-war claim that we take with a little bit of ease, which is, what do you look at the eyes of these men, and what are we creating? A nation of what are we creating? A nation of savages or people who are emotionally dead. That's the moment that the change of policy emerged, and the problems associated with mobile killing units led to the change of policy, and that is the creation of an institution which we know now is called the death camp. Death camp evolved from the concentration camp, but instead of containing these Jews and working them under the most difficult conditions, they created factories of death. The staffing of the Aktion Reinhard camps came from the Germans' first experience of killing, which was the T4 program, the so-called T4 program, the euthanasia program, which brought Germans of special needs, what we're going to use in German speak, mentally retarded, physically infirm, emotionally distraught, congenitally ill and handicapped Germans, and brought them to killing centers and gassed them. And there were 6 killing centers, and the staff of these killing centers, which began by killing in tens and hundreds and thousands, then went on to staff the Einsatz, to staff the Aktion Reinhard camps, where they didn't kill in thousands, they killed in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions. And they had evolved from small to large. Let's talk a little bit about the origin of the death camp. The decision on creating the death camp was made somewhere in the neighborhood of October or November of 1941. This has become a little bit controversial because the former and future Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, said Hitler got his inspiration from the Mufti. The meeting with the Mufti was in late November, and Hitler needed no inspiration from the Mufti for the gassing of the Jews, because clearly we know that by early November, the decision was made that Jews could not leave Germany or any of the occupied territories, because a decision had been made regarding their annihilation. And the first of the death camps that opened was the death camp of Chelmno near Lodz in German-occupied Poland. And there the killing retained itself by mobile gas vans. People came up to a manor. They were brought in at the top level. They were sent down to the basement. They were forced to undress. They were then loaded onto trucks. The trucks went for about 20 or 30 minutes, and they hooked up a rubber hose from the exhaust of the truck to the back of the truck, and it was like a furniture van. And essentially after a 20-minute or 25-minute drive, they were taken to the woods, and they drove along this path to the woods, where by the time they arrived, almost all, if not all, were dead. Their bodies were first buried in mass graves, and later they were burned. And this became the first of the death camps called Chelmno. What is the origin of the Aktion Reinhard camps? And Chelmno began its killing on December 8th, 1941. It began its killing within 2 months of the decision. It began its killing 8 or 9 days after the meeting with the Mufti, so it could not have happened that quickly. And then the action changed dramatically. And the Aktion Reinhard camps were based on the opposite. I want to use the word metaphor, but metaphor is too clean a word. They're based on the opposite. If you no longer send mobile killers to stationary victims, how do you reverse the process? You reverse the process by making the victims mobile, and you send them to stationary killing centers, which combine Henry Ford's notion of the assembly line of death with Charles Darwin's notion of survival of the fittest. And that is that you create a factory whose end product is dead Jews, and which essentially not only end product is dead Jews, but essentially it not only robs the Jews, but it even recycles them using whatever they have, their clothes, their gold from teeth, their hair, their body fat, their bodies itself, in a process of recycling. The instrumentality that is chosen is the gas chamber. And in these camps, for example, in Treblinka, they used what? They used the former Soviet tank engine. Only later do they begin to use Zyklon B at Auschwitz. And the 3 camps are created. They are created in the following order: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. You all know the famous meeting at the Wannsee Conference. And the Wannsee Conference essentially was not a place where the decision was made. It was a place where essentially everybody involved in the decision was told that the SS would be in charge, that you were going to be subordinate, and that the process was going to be immediate. How do we understand the meaning of the Wannsee Conference? We have, first of all, the minutes of the Wannsee Conference. And the second is that we have one other figure that I use in every museum, based on Christopher Browning's important work, Ordinary Men. And that is that when the Wannsee Conference was convened, between 75 and 80% of the Jews who were to be murdered in the Holocaust were still alive. 16 months later, between 75 and 80% of the Jews who were murdered, who were to die in the Holocaust, were already dead. Why is the Wannsee Conference important? Because it got the entire, essentially, the bureaucracy of the German nation, the army and the railroad authorities, and all of the other relevant ministries and the party apparatus together. It greenlit the idea that murder was going to be by gas, and over a period of time, it established the 3 major death camps of Aktion Reinhard: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Let me give you figures for a moment so you'll be able to understand the scope of this. Belzec was an operation from late February 1942 to December 1942. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 Jews were murdered by a staff of 104, of whom 14 were SS, the rest were Ukrainians. And we only have 2 known survivors. 500,000 Jews murdered, a staff of 104, of whom only 14 are Germans, 2 known survivors. Sobibor was established in the spring of 1942 and operated until November of 1943, when a revolt ceased its operation. Between 250 and between 200 and 250,000 Jews were murdered. And Treblinka, which was the most sophisticated of all of the camps, of all of the Aktion Reinhard camps, was opened. And for Jews on a Jewish calendar, you have to understand this, it was opened literally on the eve of Tisha B'Av 1942. And it was closed it ceased operation in 1943, after again the revolt at Treblinka. 925,000 Jews, more or less, were killed. They were killed by a staff of 120, of whom 30 were Germans. So if you talk about efficiency, if you talk about effectiveness, if you talk about completeness, and there were 67 known survivors of Treblinka. And I'm using the words precisely because some survivors were not known and some had escaped but were not linked as survivors of Treblinka. There were 67, 925,000 killed, a staff of 120, so 44 men at Treblinka and Belzec were responsible for the murder of 1.4 million Jews, with a survival ratio of 0.00002 at Belzec, and a survival ratio of 99 and 999, and a murder ratio of 99.9999% at Treblinka. What was the advantage of this? It was systematic, it was structural, it was out of sight, and it allowed for the systematic clearing of the ghettos all the way through. That's the importance of Aktion Reinhard, and that's the way in which it functioned. Let me just conclude, and then I'll take questions. The railroads became indispensable. Chelmno needed trucks to get there. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka needed trains. Auschwitz became Auschwitz because at Auschwitz there were 44 parallel railroad tracks. And consequently, Jews could be shipped from all over the world to Auschwitz because it had the railroad infrastructure. And the idea then is that the concentration camp became a killing center. There was no selection at Sobibor, no selection at Treblinka, no selection at Belzec. Everybody was sent to their death, with the rarest of exceptions of people who were needed, who were essentially carpenters, plumbers, electricians, and jewelers, because they needed to recycle this material. So the idea was total systematic annihilation. And it took a very, very, very long time for us to understand what happened at these camps. And the reason it took a long time for us to understand what happened at these camps is there were so few survivors. Let's take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It has been extremely interesting and thought-provoking and heartbreaking speech and presentation on your end. We will now look at the chat and we'll be collecting questions. But before that, let me start with the first question. What it is? Did the world knew about this process? I mean, what was the reports that were that one could read in newspapers in the US or even closer in UK about those processes that you described?
Well, let's begin by saying the information was rare We did have, for example, a map of Treblinka made it to the Polish government exile in London. And there was a statement on the BBC of what was happening. And the most famous of all was the escape of Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wexler from Auschwitz itself. They escaped on April 7th, 1944. They brought to the Slovakian underground, Slovakian Jewish underground, reports of what happened with Auschwitz, even with the maps of Auschwitz. And it was called the Auschwitz Protocols. And only as late as 1944, in May and June of 1944, did the information become clear at Auschwitz. And remember, there's a reason for that. Part of it is it was it was unbelievable. And remember, people use language about the death camps and the Holocaust in general. Inconceivable, unbelievable, incomprehensible. And that means that it took a lot for it to penetrate, even when you had the information, it took a lot for it to penetrate that this was real, that this was actually happening. So consequently, the information, and we in Holocaust scholarship differentiate between information and knowledge. Information has to reach a certain threshold before it becomes knowledge. I'm going to give you an interesting way to perceive it. Sociologists say that you have to have externalization, which is the presentation of information. Objectification, it's confirmation, and internalization, when you see the world through that perspective. Somebody comes up to me and tells me one of my students is pregnant. I don't believe it. The woman is sophisticated, she's responsible, she's careful, she's cautious, etc., etc. A week later, she asked to be excused from class because she looks like she's about to throw up. And I think all of a sudden, oh, she really is pregnant, because I'm seeing it through the information I didn't believe a week ago. And then she says, Professor Birnbaum, I want to speak with you, but you have to tell me it's confidential. You won't tell the administration, and you won't tell the administration, you won't tell my parents. And what do I think she's going to tell me? She's going to tell me she's pregnant, because they've already internalized that information. People who internalized the information of the death camps behaved as if it was absolutely essential. They couldn't conduct business as usual. They had to scream and shout and do everything imaginable. What in part led to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, was the fact that they sent a man by the name of Zygmunt Freilich out on the trains, who had been contact with the Union railway workers. They sent him on trains, and he arrived in Malkinia. And he brought back word of what was happening in Treblinka. Therefore, in Warsaw, they understood that Treblinka meant death, and therefore you didn't, board the trains, because you were going to die. Prior to that, it was rumor. Prior to that, it was unconfirmed, etc., etc., etc. So you needed to get clear information. When we talk about the bombing of Auschwitz, I always say there was a decision made on June 11th, 1944, by David Ben-Gurion and the cabinet of the Yishuv, not to request that Auschwitz was bombed, because that Auschwitz be bombed. In fact, they admonished the Grunbaum. They admonished him for even speaking to the Americans about bombing Auschwitz, saying, we do not know enough about the situation in Poland to request that we bomb innocent Jews and kill them. By July 8th, 26 days later, Moshe Shertak, who then became Moshe Sharet, and Chaim Weizmann are requesting of Anthony Eden that Auschwitz be bombed. What's the difference between June 11th and July 8th? The difference is they got the Verba Wexler report, and they understood that Jews were actually being killed. Therefore, if you destroy the infrastructure, you destroy the capacity to kill.
Thank you, Michael, and we're now having questions pouring in. I will select only few as we won't have that much time. One of the questions is, you said that Sobibor and Treblinka ended as killing centers after revolts. Why weren't there more revolts? I mean, the question probably is why in those places there were revolts, why in other there were not?
Why were there? Look, the revolts. The interesting thing is the revolt at Treblinka took place after the uprising in Warsaw. They understood the uprising in Warsaw. And the other thing that happened is that business had quotation marks slowed down, meaning that they had already achieved. Why did Belzec close? Belzec closed because the Jews of Galicia, and you are in the Galician State Museum, all of the Jews of Galicia were already killed. There were no more trains to send. There was no more population there. When business slowed down for the killing centers, they understood that they were next, and therefore they organized for resistance. In Sobibor, you had the double advantage. You had a Soviet Jewish soldier with military training who joined together with a Jewish leader who had charisma and power, and they were able to organize the resistance and the revolt at Sobibor, and that gave people the opportunity to escape. But why? Because they understood that they were about to die. And very often that type of revolt was not because they expected to win, but because they wanted at least the opportunity to choose either how they died or giving themselves the possibility of at least escape. They also, interestingly enough, if you look at it, what they sought in escape was they had to prepare for it. They had to prepare for it by also stealing money. So they had something on the outside, and also stealing revolvers and guns, if possible, because if you had that, then you had the capacity of joining the partisans. But without a weapon, you could not survive. Without money, you could not survive. And the most remarkable thing is to see some people who escaped Treblinka went back to ghettos because it was the safest place to live, knowing that they would not board the train because the train led to Treblinka and led to death. But it was so difficult to live on the outside and to pass as a non-Jew that they found themselves walking back into the ghetto in order to live.
Thank you, Michael. We have a number of questions about the neighbors or the other nationalities, Slovaks, Hungarians, the Poles. The questions are whether those nations were actively killing the Jews, whether they were involved in the process.
Let's again. The Poles are 1,000% right when they say there were no Polish concentration camps. There were there were Nazi concentration camps and not the Nazi death camps in German-occupied Poland. And consequently, meaning, and what that meant essentially was that the Germans chose to establish the camps outside of the view of the German population. And they did that essentially because it made it easier for them to handle their domestic problems. And one of the unique roles of Theresienstadt, of Terezin, was to serve as the VIP, quotation marks, concentration camp, etc., etc. It served there for people whose absence from Germany would have been noted by the political and the economic and the social elite. So we have to say that Jews did not find an easy reception among the general population. If there were two ways of hiding, one way was to pass as a non-Jew, easier for women rather than men. A, women were not circumcised, and B, Religious women were generally educated in secular schools. Religious men were educated in Jewish schools. Religious women had greater capacity with the language. And the other is, it also depended on how you looked, because if you were going to pass by that, and also how you behaved. I remember learning from Vladka Mit, who was an operative on the Aryan side of Warsaw, getting guns for and ammunition for the Jews in the ghetto. Vladka Mit said that when she was approached, what she did was to do the opposite of what anybody imagined. She started laughing, but not laughing softly. She laughed loud, making herself a target. And she said, because most people, if they're in danger, go like this. And to go like this was to show that you were afraid of nothing and no one. So somebody approached her, we're going to turn you in. She says, let's go. And she laughed out loud so that everybody on the whole street saw her. And they all of a sudden became what? Became afraid of her because of the freedom involved. The second way of hiding was to find people who were willing to hide you. And again, that means taking someone into your house for a time you do not know how long that's going to be, and putting yourself at risk and your family at risk, especially in Poland. So those people were extraordinary. We call them upstanders. Yad Vashem exalts them, calls them righteous among the nations of the earth. I don't like that pedagogically, because I don't think most kids seek to be righteous, but we all seek to be what? Decent and nice. And you know what in Yiddish they call to be a mensch. So that becomes a very important. What is the role of population? It depends where and how. Many survivors on the death march say that they knew they were in Czechoslovakia because all of a sudden people were throwing food at them in a way that they did not have in other countries. And then we all know the story of the way in which the Danes treated their Jewish community, and Sweden was willing to receive the Danish Jewish population because they were Scandinavian Jews. And also in 1943, they understand that Germany was going to lose the war. It was a matter of time.
Thank you, Professor. And let us take one last question, which is about the structure of the Reinhard organization that ran the camps. We have the question is the understanding from Itzhak Arad's book is that the camps were operated as a business, so-called business. Could you please refer to that?
The most interesting thing that we know is the Nazis had no budget for the operation of death camps. The operation of death camps had to be profit-making enterprises to pay for the operation that was taking place. How did they pay for the operation that was taking place? By, first of all, robbing people of their remaining goods. In Auschwitz, they recycled the human body, meaning they took gold out of their gold teeth out of the mouth and sent it to the Reichsbank, which sent it to Switzerland. They used hair as detonators, and we also know, those of us who are losing our hair understand that hair is a liner, is a very good and important liner. They used it to line, they used it to make fabric. And then they also had, in Auschwitz, they had something called Canada, which was opulent, which is where they gathered all of the material wealth that people had brought with them, and people brought with them to the camps. What do you take if you're leaving home? You take basic elements of survival. You also take some of the most valuable things that you have. There's a very interesting film that's about to come out. In Auschwitz, the Nazis sent a numismatics expert to find the best stamps, because if you're a stamp collector, what did you bring with you? You brought your stamp collection. And this numismatics expert sent the best stamps back to high-ranking Nazi officials for their stamp collection. Rumors had it, because of the way in which he saw somebody in his family saw a psychiatrist, that not only did he send the best back, but he stole the very best and buried them in a building in Poland near Auschwitz, and buried them and never had time to go back to pick them up. So these guys have been searching for the hidden treasure. And I don't want to bring it out, but they're searching for the hidden treasure. Why? Because they took everything they could of the victims. And I've written in my things that they essentially reduced the victim to a consumable raw material to be discarded in the process of manufactured and recycled into the Nazi war economy. No budget. And all of us run institutions and understand that we have to balance what income with expenditures. Budgets are some of the driving forces of the institutions that we run. Anybody who runs the government understands how do you allocate the resources of the government. You allocate the resource to the government by budget. And this was the budget. So that's part of the organization. But remember, the SS was a minor part of the staff of the camp. And the most major part of it is organization, structure, the structure of evil as it evolved. And that's what, and the other thing about Aktion Reinhard camps, which is incredible, is to think of their efficiency. 500,000 Jews, less than 10 months, 2 known survivors. 925,000 Jews, more or less, 13 months, 67 known survivors. The structure of evil, the incredible magnitude of what was achieved, minimum of resources, maximum of accomplishment, thorough annihilation. That's the legacy. And one of the things that makes the Holocaust so catastrophically fascinating is that this is based on the maxima of the principles essential to the creation of Western society: maximum efficiency, minimal use of labor, use of structure for annihilation.
Thank you, Professor, for addressing this question, and indeed for delivering this chilling presentation. I would like to thank all of you, all the participants from all corners of the world who participated today. We had almost 900 participants registered. The links with the recording will be sent to every person who registered, and again, the recording will be available through Galicia Jewish Museum YouTube channel, as well as, I'm sure, through the channels of our partners. And again, please bear in mind that this is only a first program in the series of 4. So already today, I would like to encourage you to pencil in December 7 for the second lecture, Mass Killing in 1942-1943, Operation Reinhard Killing Centers, with the speakers Chris Webb and Tali Nates. January 18th, resistance in Treblinka, and February 9, what do we remember? So please stay with us, and also follow up follow the pages, web pages, and Facebook profiles of all of the institutions that organize this program: Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, Ghetto Fighters House, and the Galicia Jewish Museum. There are other programs happening beyond this one. December 1st, we are at the Galicia Jewish Museum. We organize online program meeting with Professor Omer Bartow on Galicia. Michael has mentioned Galicia and its importance. Professor Bartow is looking at the Galicia from a different angle, trying to understand the importance, the origins of importance of Galicia and the Galician Jews. But again, let me thank, first of all, Professor Berenbaum. Michael, thank you so much again for this speech and joining us this evening, morning. It has been an honor to listen to you. And I hope I see you next year in Jerusalem, but also in Krakow, hopefully.
Okay, next year in Krakow for me.
Lovely.
Take care.
Thank you all. Be safe. Have a good evening, good night, and a good day. Thank you.